Zelda Tears of the Kingdom's dungeons, perhaps still the greatest mote in the eye of a game that's otherwise received near universal rapture. What went right and wrong, what do the developers say, and why have they made the choices that they did? Plus, what would need to change for us to see a return to classic dungeon design in the next Zelda title? Dungeons weren't a new issue to Tears of the Kingdom. It was not only a major area of feedback from Breath of the Wild, but it's clear that the team knew fans' opinion because they explicitly addressed the return of dungeons in marketing, something that seemed a little mystifying to many after they actually played the game. However, depending on what features you're looking for, there are indeed some ways that they can be said to have listened to and acted on feedback, and that dungeons are, in their lights, back. It's certainly true that they look the part. No more identikit divine beast aesthetics or shrine dress. Each of the Tears temples looks markedly different aesthetically, which, to be fair, does answer one of the major criticisms people had. As well as themed locations, the route to get to these temples involves quite a lot of puzzle solving and some super events before you even start. I loved this process when I was playing it. The horde attacks in Gerudo Town was a terrific bit of variety in the gameplay that I'd love to see used more often, and ascending to the water temple in the sky was tremendous fun and required a lot of careful traversal. The whole process reminded me hugely of Skyward Sword, where the route to the dungeon was often so labyrinthine and elaborate that it felt like getting there qualified as an additional dungeon in its own right. It's not quite the same. Skyward Sword's every inch of ground level was so carefully mapped out and sweated over that it was like a giant puzzle box, whereas it's still possible to cheese your way through big sections of, say, the route to the water temple if you have the right equipment or just enough batteries. I'm not sure if I mind that personally, but it certainly does change the design approach, and while the route is great fun, it's also true that it's a sequence of discrete traversal challenges rather than anything resembling a dungeon of old. It has more in common with a Super Mario title in this sense. The discrete regions also have distinct mechanics, such as the ship sails you can bounce on or the water bubbles you can travel with, let alone the whole mecha concept with Monero. In this case, the mechanics are locked to the region rather than being something Link can acquire and use. Anti-gravity is not a power he can utilise in the game, although that would be kind of interesting. It's actually quite a departure from the stated aim of the game for everything to be accessible and for all the different abilities to build multiplicatively on one another to have some mechanics which simply never return. I also have to praise the bosses, which are each a big step up from Breath of the Wild, although perhaps that would not be tremendously difficult. They're creative, they're surprising, even quite funny. There are even the equivalent of old midpoint bosses which usually appear at an earlier point. I know not all of them were to everyone's taste, but I found it satisfying to battle all of them. Yeah, even Muktarok. Queen Gibdo is a strange one in that she really makes a mockery of the idea that you could do these in any order. Sure, if you're a super player, maybe, but for ordinary middle-of-the-road gamers, that's not one for the faint of heart, although I suppose with the right equipment and recipes, even that boss is accessible, and that's one of the glories of the game design. Finally, one aspect that seems to have gone for good is the presence of particular power or ability tied to a dungeon that comes to be useful within it. And yet, actually, this is the job that the sages really provide in the game. The problem is that these abilities that they're offering are essentially ancillary, of only mild benefit, because the game needs to be readily accessible even without them. Because they're in the category of nice to have, rather than essential features, even though the abilities do help with a number of puzzles, they aren't absolutely key to them in the way that the old dungeon items were. It's also a little strange given that the dungeons were generally solitary experiences, that all these temples are navigated with a buddy in tow, but this isn't the end of the world. Okay, we've looked through all the ways the Tears of the Kingdom teams took steps towards at least the appearance of having traditional dungeons, enough perhaps to even convince themselves that they had addressed the criticisms they faced for the divine beasts in Breath of the Wild. However, we must now drill into the areas where Tears of the Kingdom dungeons still do not pass muster. I'm not the Boss Keys channel, and I wouldn't dream of being able to analyse the differences between the various dungeon styles in that level of depth, but for the most part it seems like the old dungeons were essentially what to do. You just need to find the puzzle and then act upon it. There are a couple that took me a while, but they're not significantly different in challenge level than the shrine puzzles, even if the aesthetic of the dungeons is far more compelling than the shrines become after the first few. It's just the puzzles themselves that feel a little woeful. One explanation is direct to Hidemaro Fujibayashi. Perhaps he just doesn't like puzzles. But the thing is, this doesn't hold water in the slightest. The man was responsible for the very dungeon-rich Skyward Sword, plus Oracle of Ages, Oracle of Seasons, and Minish Cap, which are beloved not least for their intricate dungeon designs. This is a man who can design a great puzzle box dungeon. It's not that they've forgotten how to design a dungeon, it's that they're consciously choosing to design them in a different way. One obvious reason for the new format is that it keeps with the spirit of the rest of the games in terms of freedom. There are 5 keys that you can complete, and you can complete them in any order. Superficially, this gives the player a great degree of freedom, compared to some of the vast puzzle boxes of yore. But in reality, that choice is incredibly artificial. You may get to choose the order you tackle the puzzles in, but at the end of the day, all the puzzles still need solving, and in a relatively condensed space. It's very much the illusion of choice rather than actual choice, because the end goal is still gated behind specific actions. It's just that there are 5 actions here rather than 1. And as for the Warrior Battle linear experience, many of the shrines are sequences of 2 or 3 line puzzles which build upon one another. In this sense, they're not that different structurally from a Super Mario level, where you are introduced to a concept, then you get to test that concept out, and then you get to apply it in a way that uses all that you've learned so far. These aren't drastically different from dungeon puzzles in terms of complexity, so it does seem frustrating to me that they didn't at least apply the same logic of having the puzzles codependent and sequential to increase the level of complexity within a dungeon at least slightly. Another issue that I find curious is the provision of the map right at the beginning. Finding a map was always a moment of triumph in navigating a Zelda dungeon, but here the joy of discovery is kind of removed from the off, as you are given the locations you need to find. Zelda has become very good at avoiding being a map-watching game, with good use of the HUD to mark directions, and by using the landscape and the world around, it differs from other open-world games in that you really can just turn off the map and explore for chunks of the time, unless you're really looking for something specific. It's a strange choice of the temples then that suddenly, instead of interacting with the landscapes, you end up consulting the map to find good routes. I also have to wonder why, at the very least, finding the map couldn't have been a mini-quest by itself. But this isn't to say they didn't hear the complaints about the dungeons. Not only did they hear them, but dungeons were mentioned in surveys ahead of the games and were clearly part of their advertising blitz. So look, instead of evaluating them by our lights, what were the Tears of the Kingdom dungeons designed for, and were they successful in achieving those aims? Speaking to The Verge, Fujibayashi had some interesting statements. He said, "With Breath of the Wild, there was a theme of moving dungeons, and that's why the dungeons turned out to be the way they did there. With this theme of seamlessness, we thought about things like how we could realise the fantasy of being able to dive from the sky into a dungeon, and not have anything that comes in between you. Or, if you wanted or needed to take a break, you could step out of the dungeon and go right back inside, all seamlessly." The seamlessness is impressive, and while it's chiefly a technical marvel over a gameplay one, it nevertheless adds to the feel of the game as a cohesive whole. Just looking at the entrances to shrines, it strikes me that if there ever is a souped-up special edition of Tears of the Kingdom later on down the road on seriously improved hardware, there is some chance that they will try to make the shrines easy to walk in and out of, as the introductory animation makes it clear that Link is just popping through a hole in the wall, and if you take out the loading screens, you could easily imagine it simulating moving back and forth between the open world and the shrine. Until or unless we get the inevitable remaster in 10 years' time, I doubt we'll see it, but it will be interesting to see if it's something they ever do patch in. Of course, this idea of seamlessness was something that was crucial to the development of Tears of the Kingdom, but they like to approach things differently with different games. Clearly, that was not the objective with Breath of the Wild. Breath of the Wild was about moving dungeons, and I can expect that they will change their theme, change their focus with the next game, and hopefully what they'll look to do is to implement a theme, an idea that focuses on achievement and building up a set of challenges, as opposed to checking off a list of different puzzles in order to achieve the end goal. So look, with seamlessness being such a huge focus for them, was it the case that the team just ran out of bandwidth to improve the core dungeons themselves? I actually think, though, the 5-key format was thought through and is essential to how they want these dungeons to work. Think about it. If you're able to pop in and out of the dungeon seamlessly, it makes it very difficult to expect players to hold large amounts of information about dungeon layout in such a way that is needed to succeed in such a large challenge. And while having large challenges isn't innately a problem in a game like this, the risk is that it turns some people off the game. Not necessarily the hardcore fans, but of course Tears of the Kingdom has many millions of players compared to previous Zelda games. There are a lot of gamers who are approaching this in a much more casual manner. And whereas everything in Breath and Tears is designed to constantly distract gamers into playing a little bit more, into following that star piece or hunting that shrine or that Korok, old school big monolithic dungeons will be a place where the more casual audience that the series has cultivated in the last 2 titles could find that their patience wears a bit thin. I know I've found points in games where there's a huge challenge and I just end up becoming lost, losing my thread and not really returning. Time becomes an issue, whatever it is, but for one reason or another, it becomes a block. And this is something that I don't think Nintendo can afford to happen With Zelda, they want people not just to start playing the game, but to continue playing the game, and for this to be something that hooks people in over the long term. I think this is a really genuine issue in the fate of dungeons, and one Zelda overcomes to a large degree because there's never really a friction point in these games, and I'm talking about the Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom games. If you hit a brick wall somewhere in one of these two games, there's always something else to do, and the game is almost never fussy about what you need to do in order to feel like you're progressing, so therefore players can continue and enjoy the experience even if they are challenged by individual sections. So does this mean that casualized dungeons are the only way forward for Zelda? Not necessarily. First, we should acknowledge that dungeons are and have always been a celebrated part of the Zelda formula, and I think the team wants them to remain popular and celebrated. I don't necessarily think there is a love relationship with the new dungeon formula, and so I think the baseline probability of the next game having more elaborate and intricate dungeons is decent. But it needs to work with the team's goals, which prompts the question, under what circumstances would they come back? Firstly, I think they can easily bring back hunting for dungeon maps, especially as this doesn't need to take place within the dungeon itself. With fast travel points, it would be easy enough to give players an option: soldier on blind with the additional challenge that entails, or retreat to find a map. This is a microcosm of the structure of the final bosses of these games, an option accessible from early on for hardcore gamers. Indeed, the maps don't need to be tied to the dungeon. They made the interesting choice to litter the sky with maps for treasures in the depths, even though you could ultimately run across these treasures in the depths through routine exploration anyway. However, it's not a terrible idea to have the maps separate, as although it slightly reduces the complexity of the challenge within the dungeon, it also gives an opportunity for less confident players to give themselves a leg up before they even enter. Then there's the dungeon structure. Having 5 major keys in 5 locations is not a terrible idea, but it would be better if there was a sequence and a progression, and also if every single dungeon did not follow this particular pattern. 1 or 2, fine. All of them, not so much. Making greater use of small keys could allow for some flexibility with this. If sections of the dungeon are inaccessible at first, you will be funneled to approach the dungeons in such a way that allows for a progression of difficulty and ideas, giving the dungeons the same sense of progression across a series of increasingly complicated scenarios in a similar theme that is already evident in some of the stronger shrines. How then do you not make the small keys a frustrating barrier? Yet again, you have a generic, open any door, small key available in the open world. You don't need a lot, and they shouldn't be cheap, but what it would do is allow anyone who is playing the game for any extended period the chance to find, or even maybe fuse and build small keys that they can use to bypass chunks of the dungeons. This would naturally accommodate the dungeons to the playstyles of the individual gamers. The people who like messing around in the overworld and are less fussed by more complex dungeons would approach the dungeons having the tools to get through them quickly, probably later on and towards the end of their play experience, while the dungeon lovers would have a more authentically structured challenge. It's clear that the dungeons need to be part of the game, but they are massively decentralized from what they were in older Zelda titles, so it feels natural that the dungeon should be developed as something that does appeal to more core gamers, while there being an accessibility option for players who would prefer that they not be such a central part of the experience. Of course, the advantage of small keys is that they're generic and could be applied across a large multitude of different dungeons. Players would be cautious to conserve keys for later opportunities, and so there would always be a soft pressure to follow the intended structure of the dungeon, but the player would not be forced to do so. It's perfectly possible that they could craft dungeon-specific workarounds for the overworld too, whether it be particular Zonai devices or the next game equivalent that allow for sequence breaking, or specific items like Dorephan scales which are hard to obtain but do allow workarounds. Sequence breaking has always been a fun part of games like this, and I think it is now very much at the heart of the Zelda experience in the era of the Wild. But I tend to think that the team will avoid burdening the dungeons with too many complex requirements. Until a trad dungeon Zelda experience can shift 20 million copies in 6 weeks, it's not clear that the demand for dungeon reform is particularly broad, even if it is felt deeply by many long-term players. So apart from tools that allow sequence breaking, one way around making the dungeons too inaccessible is the Link Between Worlds solution. Make them all accessible from the outside, but linear or at least highly structured within. I always thought the floating islands would have been useful for this, as theoretically you could enter a dungeon from any direction in the sky, but by moving the islands around, the game could provide the particular sequence of islands that you need in order to have that linear experience, even though it would feel like it was not a linear experience. Everyone will get a precision-designed experience, but it would feel like a function of organic exploration, at least for the first playthrough. Obviously, for later playthroughs, that illusion would disappear. Still, this is probably a complex thing to program, and since they didn't go there in Tears of the Kingdom, I don't necessarily expect them to do it in any future game. I also think this is where something like fuse and crafting mechanics could recur to give players an incentive to enter each temple besides just another heart. What if you could only fuse fire to weapons after you bested the fire temple? Having fire arrows isn't for the most part essential, but it's by far one of the most useful tools in the game. Perhaps also this could be an answer to the infamous weapon breaking criticism. Perhaps each dungeon could have particular weaponry or armor which would never break and would have specific advantages. It's tricky, of course, because the more you gate these abilities behind a tough dungeon, the more you risk the overworld becoming anemic by comparison. I still think they will stick with the formula that without dungeon items traversal is possible, but just a bit more difficult. But maybe, if the dungeon items were that bit more tempting, it might help justify the greater complexity of the challenges within them. Normally at this point I try to do a forecast of what's likely to happen, but the trouble here is even defining the terms of the forecast, since from the Zelda team's perspective, it seems that they did bring back dungeons in Tears of the Kingdom, so from their point of view, they could give themselves a big tick already. I suspect that there will be a slow shuffle towards greater complexity in dungeons, but not the all-out leap into trad dungeons that I fear many people are looking for. At this point, it seems to me that the ideal situation would be to have simply a separate style of game. If the 2D Zelda series returns, perhaps pushing into a 2.5D Zelda in places that absorbs some of the linear 3D elements as well, this could carve itself out a niche in the same manner as the highly designed Metroidvania-style games. However, given how labour-intensive these Zelda games are, I guess the problem is one of manpower. It also seemed to be one of interest, and while I noticed in the comments that Fujibayashi gets a lot of stick as being the face of the new Zelda, even though he's also the director of the ultra-linear Skyward Sword, as I mentioned before, Eiji Aonuma has actually been the most vocal in pushing what is essentially a no-turning-back narrative in regard to the old linear style. He said to Eurogamer, "It's interesting because I'm wondering, why do you want to go back to a type of game where you're more limited or more restricted in the types of things you can play?" He says he understands it from a nostalgia point of view, but not from a point of view of a modern game. I'm reminded a little of Kensuke Tanabe's apparent resistance to criticisms around Paper Mario's move from standard RPG mechanics, but I think Aonuma is absolutely genuine in wanting the most free experience of players, so ultimately the question isn't how does Zelda backtrack to get its dungeons back, but how can they square the circle of free and open dungeons, porous enough so that players can drop in and out, but simultaneously having puzzles which feel satisfyingly complex, with some kind of internal narrative and rhythm. It's a tough one, but I do trust that they will have this criticism in mind and be working towards addressing it, even while in the same breath I'm not 100% sure how likely they are to find a solution anytime soon. The problem is simply incredibly tough. But there must be solutions out there. How would you create a dungeon that satisfies the requirements of freedom from the open-air style, but simultaneously is as satisfying to complete as the old ones? Please share your ideas in the comments section below, and in the meantime, thank you so much for watching. Take care, and stay cool.